The doctor noted the patient's weird round spots on their finger and, after an examination, called the police. Initially, when Mark noticed the strange lesions on his thumb, he panicked. When he first discovered the glitch, he had no idea what had caused it or how dangerous it was, and eventually does find out. He rushed to the doctor's office right after. But when he got there, the doctor told him that it wasn't looking good. The doctor called the police as soon as they knew what was going on. Mark was just left without any explanation. The doctor had done some tests on him, and after seeing the results, he immediately informed the police and ran out of the room, leaving him behind with no explanation. Mark started to panic as he now felt serious about this problem was. He then found out that the doctor had locked the door on him. Peter started to see red. He started banging against the door with his full weight, trying to break it open, and with a couple of hits, it gave way. He was now face to face with the doctors that had locked him in. The doctor was now forced to give Mark an explanation as to what he had discovered, and upon hearing it, Peter collapsed onto the floor. What were those holes in Mark's fingers? And why did the police need to be getting involved? Before we go on, like this video, smash the subscribe button and click the notification bell. Let's proceed on the video. Mark didn't notice anything wrong when he woke up. It seemed like any other morning he had gotten up and shuffled to the kitchen to make his coffee. He didn't even notice anything wrong while he made the coffee, until he was about to pour it into his cup when he saw it and he was ready to scream. 40-year-old Mark was a single man. He had dated in the past, but it had never gone well. He hoped that this time it would be different. He spent a lot of time preparing for the date he really wanted to go well, and would be the first time they'd met in person, but not everything would go to plan. He met the woman online and knew it was a long shot, but he met up with her. The date was nothing extraordinary. She really didn't seem that interested, and he wasn't sure if he was wanting to see her again, but the next morning he wasn't sure he didn't. After all, what was beyond strange? He didn't want to pull her into it when he didn't even know what was going on. Mark discovered that there was something strange about his thumb. It ached a bit, but it wasn't until he looked closely at it and saw exactly why his thumb was hurting, and it scared the living daylights out of him. What was happening to him? Mark's thumb was covered with tiny holes. He thought that maybe something had stuck to his thumb, but bringing it closer to him, he saw that the holes were digging into his skin. He pressed on it with his other fingers, and it hurt a bit more. Something was very clearly wrong, but what? Mark thought a bit. Maybe some insect had bitten him or even crawled into him. Maybe it had latched onto his thumb in the night, but he'd never seen a bug do anything like this. Mark searched online and came to the conclusion that no bug had done this. It had to be something worse. The more Mark looked at his thumb, the more confused he became. These weren't just tiny holes. There was something inside the holes. He couldn't make it out, but he was sure there was something else there. The holes were hard, and whatever inside was too. He needed to do something, and he had just the idea. Mark decided that he was going to try to dig out whatever was in his thumb with tweezers. He went to the bathroom and pulled out his tweezers, but before he could dig into his thumb, he hesitated. He didn't really have any idea what he was dealing with. Doing this could make it even worse, but he still had to do something. Mark didn't like doctors. He preferred to take care of things himself. He rarely would go unless something was severely bad. And as much as he hated the idea of going to the doctor, he knew that this wasn't something he should take care of by himself, so he took the leap and called the doctor. The doctor's office set up a semi-emergency appointment for that same afternoon. They told him that there would be others ahead of him, but they definitely would see him by the end of the day at the latest. In the meantime, the doctor told Mark that he needed to do something for him. The doctor told Mark that he needed to think about anything that was different recently, that he could have caused this. Anything out of the ordinary. It would greatly help the doctor to figure out what exactly was wrong. Margaret agreed to think about it and hung up the phone. What could have done? He really didn't know. Mark thought back over the last week. He hadn't really done anything too out of the ordinary. He went on a hike through the forest a couple days ago. He easily could have touched something out there. Maybe a mushroom or a contaminated piece of moss. That could definitely be an option, maybe. As Mark continued to think about the hike, that didn't make much sense. Surely other people had gone hiking on that same trail. It was a popular route. He wouldn't be the first person to be experiencing this. There have been other signs. He decided to rule it out as an answer, but there had to be something else. It was difficult to think of anything that was out of the routine. Mark was an average guy. He didn't do anything much except hike occasionally and go to the local coffee shop. He worked from home and didn't go outside that much. He really was a boring person, but then it hit him. There was something else that was out of the ordinary. Mark had gone on the date the night before. He'd been talking with the woman online for a while, and he eventually decided to go on a date. Mark had been excited to try out dating again. He still hadn't found his soulmate and was hoping that this date would go well. Things would end up taking an unexpected turn. From the moment the date began, Mark felt like something was off about the woman. She didn't really seem interested in him. It was almost like she despised him. But as soon as he would start thinking that she'd do something that showed that she was invested, it was just a strange date. But there was something more. Thinking back, Mark wasn't sure why she'd even contacted him in the first place. Looking through his messages with her, he could see more and more that she didn't really like him. He'd just been a bit desperate and wasn't thinking clearly. Could she have something to do with all of this? Mark couldn't see how she'd have anything to do with this. They hadn't got physical at all, and he hadn't contacted her since last night. She had not messaged him either. If she had done something, wouldn't she have said something? Mark was not sure, but it was time for his appointment. He had to go. Mark had no clue what was going on with his thumb when he left for his appointment. He continued to think while he was driving to the doctor's office, but he came up with nothing. Luckily, the holes on his thumb didn't seem to be changing too much. They'd grown a bit bigger and were more obvious to the eye now. But it wasn't that bad, right? He got to the doctor's office and sat in his car for a second trying to come up with any more answers. Mark really couldn't think of anything else. With a deep breath to calm his nerves, Mark walked into the doctor's office and signed in. He figured he'd have to wait a long time to see the doctor. But people had different plans. While the waiting room at the doctor's office, Mark was getting a ridiculous amount of attention. At this point, the holes in his thumb were very plain to see, and everyone around him was shocked by what they were seeing. Mark didn't notice too much until the rest of the people's curiosity became increasingly obvious. The other people in the office did not try to hide their curiosity. The few kids there wanted to go look, but their parents held them back. It was as if everyone forgot why they were there with their own medical complaints. Everybody wanted to know what was happening to him. To be fair, so did Mark. It was then that the doctor came out to call the next patient. Everyone there collectively agreed that Mark should be seen first. None of their problems were serious, but Mark's clearly was. Mark was a bit put off by this, but thanked them nonetheless. It was concerning, but surely he could wait. The doctor did not agree. Once inside his office, the doctor was able to take a proper look at Mark's thumb, and he was shocked. He had never seen anything like this. He would remember if he had something like this was not something you just forgot. In addition, even more, the doctor hadn't even heard of anything like this in his medical books. He was clueless. The doctor knew that this was going to take some time. He made a few calls to have his waiting patients sent to other doctors on call. Mark needed his attention the most, and he was going to make sure that they were going to find a cure for whatever was going on here. The doctor ordered tests for Mark, and while they waited for the results, he studied Mark's thumb intensely. The strange thing was that while earlier, Mark had felt some pain, he did not anymore. His whole thumb was completely numb. It didn't even hurt when the doctor pushed. This was a bad sign. The doctor continued to investigate Mark's thumb, and when he got the first results back, he was disappointed. The test he had ordered had not found anything yet. There was still some others that could have to be done, but he needed Mark's permission. It would take up a lot of Mark's time. What would he do? Mark agreed to the tests, and while they waited for the results, the doctor, who still had not found anything helpful, posted a few pictures of Mark's thumb on a medical forum. He was hoping that some other doctor had seen something like this before. It would be a while before they got any response. Mark decided that he needed some air and went to use the bathroom. While he was gone, the doctor received a private message from the forum. He opened it eagerly, hoping that it was the answer he'd been seeking. In addition to his luck, it was, but it was also terrible, terrible news, and everything would have to change fast. Another doctor had indeed seen this condition before, and if they did not do something soon, it could turn into a very big problem for everyone, including Mark. The doctor read the message again and again, and knew that if this other doctor was right, that he needed to take quick action. Mark's doctor waited for the results, which came in almost immediately after he'd read the message from the forum. This was it. He had the results and it chilled him to the bone. The other doctor had been right. Mark's doctor left his office as soon and the whole place went upside down. Mark returned from the bathroom. His thumb was not looking good. The holes were starting to spread to the rest of his hand. He was getting really scared, but he knew that he had to show the doctor. There was just one problem. The doctor wasn't in his office when Mark got back. What was he to do? Mark was just deciding what to do when he heard something happen behind him. The door he'd just come through had been locked from the outside. He'd been trapped in there. And to make things even worse, he could hear the doctor telling others that he called the police what was happening. Mark begged for an explanation through the door, but no one was talking to him. All the nurses and doctors were frantically talking to each other and nobody was answering his questions. All he was told was that he needed to stay calm until the police arrived, but this was good enough for Mark. Nervous and scared, the staff's reaction to his thumb was really starting to worry him. What was so wrong? Was he going to die? A million thoughts were running through his head. He tried to stay home, but that was becoming impossible. Mark did not want to die. Soon enough, those fears were turned into anger. Why was nobody talking to him with no other idea? Mark began to kick at the door. He was desperate to get out. The doctors on the other side were yelling at him to stop, but Mark couldn't hear them over his banging. He was determined to get out. After a few kicks, the door broke and the door swung open. The people on the other side started screaming and Mark's doctor stood back. Mark stood there panting hard. It hadn't been easy to kick the door open, but he needed answers and someone had to tell him what was going on right now. Mark's doctor ordered everyone else to get away and told Mark to stay back. He shouldn't get close to anyone right now. The fear on his doctor's face told Mark everything he needed to know about his fate, but Mark was determined. He told them that he wouldn't stay back unless they gave him answers. Before his doctor could speak, 3 armed officers came into the building and spotted Mark. The doctor pointed at Mark and started screaming at him. All 3 officers took out their pistols and aimed them carefully at Mark, who was now feeling faint. Now, what the heck's going on? Mark quickly threw his hands up in the air as the police turned their attention to him. He almost had tears in his eyes and he begged them all to just tell him what was going on. Seeing that the holes on Mark's thumb had taken up almost half of his hand now, the police told him to stay back. One of the officers calmly explained to Mark that they would tell him everything, but he needed to be isolated immediately. Mark agreed to the terms, but firmly told them that he wouldn't hesitate to break open another door to get answers. He was terrified, and no one was telling him anything. Mark went back to the doctor's office and the door was closed after him. Mark could see the staff coming in with heavy cleaning materials, and they started cleaning everything. The floors, the walls, the door, you name it. Finally, the doctor came to the door to tell Mark what was going on. His doctor firstly apologized for not telling Mark what was happening. He'd been scared. It wasn't every day that a person with an awful flesh-eating virus came in and he had to follow procedures that he never had to do before. He felt awful, but there was more. He discussed with Mark what had been going on the day before. Mark had taken a hike and then gone on a date that night. Luckily for Mark, the bad date hadn't been the cause of all this. Instead, it was more likely that he touched some infected plant while out on his hike. But which one? Mark wasn't sure what to tell them. He told the police and his doctor which route he had taken and what he'd seen that might be helpful. He didn't know what else he could do. He was focused more on what the treatment plan was. Could they even treat him, or would the virus eat his hand off? Luckily for Mark, the hospital had the medication they needed, but he'd have to be in isolation for a while. The police had gotten involved because they needed to talk to him about his hike, but when they'd seen him out of his isolation room, they had panicked because his doctor had panicked. It was a big mess, but there was more. They also had to make sure that no one else would get infected. Mark was transported safely to a better hospital, where he could be in isolation and get treatment for the virus eating his hand away. Fortunately, the treatment was successful and the virus stopped spreading in just a few days. But what about the plant? Officers kept everyone off of the trail and searched for a plant that is native to the area. The root of Mark's problem was found and eliminated, so the problem should now be solved. There haven't been any cases in the past, and after a month, Mark was completely better and ready to start going on dates again. What would you think of this story?